All right. Well, I'm going to go ahead and start introduction. Although you are a person who needs no introduction, but Dr. Robert Wachter is professor and chair of the Department of Medicine at the University of California, San Francisco, where he actually holds two named titles as well, two named chair titles. He's the author of 300 articles and 6 books. Dr. Wachter coined the term hospitalist in 1996 and is often considered the father of the hospitalist field, the fastest growing specialty in the history of modern medicine. And we certainly have a humongous group here to reflect that. He's past president of the Society of Hospital Medicine, past chair of the American Board of Internal Medicine, and an elected member of the National Academy of Medicine. In 2015, Modern Healthcare magazine ranked him as the most influential physician executive in the U.S. His 2015 book, The Digital Doctor, Hope, Hype, and Harm at the Dawn of Medicine's Computer Age, was a New York Times Science bestseller. And this is going to feed very much into what we're talking about today. However, in the interim, in between 2020 and 2023, and sort of continuing, Dr. Wachter's tweets on COVID-19 were viewed more than 500 million times by 275,000 followers. And you certainly were a trusted source of information on the clinical public health and policy issues surrounding the pandemic. Our topic, I actually just want to say incredibly grateful to Dr. Wachter, who has been a great friend of Emory and has been very willing, as you guys know, to give grand rounds in this forum in the past. I think maybe part of that is because he has a grandson in Atlanta, and although is coming to us from San Francisco, I hope that's a warm, soft spot for us. Today, his talk is entitled GPT-4 and Other Generative AI, Is This Healthcare's Hemingway Moment? And I have to say that this topic was really one of the most requested topics that we had on the wish list from many for a Grand Rounds topic. And so I'm super grateful to have your insight because we're all very, very interested about where this is going to go. So thank you so very much. And I'll turn it over to you, Dr. Wachter.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Armstrong. It's a great pleasure to be with you. I wish I could be there in person, but I really prize my collaboration with Emory. Lots of very, very close friends there, and it's a wonderful place and nice to be able to be with you even virtually. Let me go to my slides, and you're wondering what does the Hemingway moment mean? I'll get to that in a second. There was thank you for reading my bio. My mother worked very carefully on it. Most of that is true. The one thing you got wrong, it's actually a granddaughter, and this is her. That's Emma, and she is now 6 weeks old, and born at an Emory hospital. So thank you for that, and she's wonderful, and I will be there quite often. So maybe we can do this in person next time. This is what I mean by our Hemingway moment. This is a line from Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, where he was talking about two characters were talking about how does a man go bankrupt? And the answer, as some of you may know, was 2 ways: gradually, then suddenly. And so the question is this healthcare's Hemingway moment when it comes to digital transformation? I spoke with you a couple of years ago and gave a semi-optimistic talk about where a digital transformation was going to go. My first probably 10 minutes of today's talk will be a little bit of recap of the history of digital transformation in healthcare, but I'll spend most of my time talking about AI and particularly the new AI, and we'll get to an answer of whether in fact this is the Hemingway moment where up till now has been clearly gradually, and then whether we will suddenly see transformation over the next few years. So here's where I'm going to go. I'm going to talk first about the last 15 years about electronic health records and what they taught us about healthcare and digital transformation. And if you can't stay for the whole talk, it's harder than it looks, is the bottom line. I'm going to talk about the history of AI in healthcare briefly, and it's been incredibly disappointing. And then we'll look at the current moment and whether the opportunities and what are the opportunities and challenges presented by the new AI, which of course you've been hearing about, you're probably playing with. Large language models or generative AI all mean sort of the same thing, just this new breakthrough that has been made in AI, such as ChatGPT or GPT-4, or what is now powering Bing and to some extent Google. And I will try to answer this question. So let's go ahead and get started. This is sort of a little background of digital transformation in healthcare. And the main point of this slide is we have gone in about 15 years from being largely a paper-based industry to being largely a digital industry. And you see a remarkable adoption curve. This sort of resembles a COVID spike. And this happened because the federal government threw $30 billion at us starting about 2010, providing incentives to hospitals and doctors' offices to adopt electronic health records. And this worked. If you think about it, $30 billion achieved something that had not been achieved prior to that, which is the digitization of a $4 trillion industry. So a pretty highly leveraged investment. We all ended up putting in electronic health records for better and a little bit for worse. For the Luddites among you, I really believe net far better. There's no question. I hear people periodically come up and say, we need to go back to paper and Post-it notes and bring back the fax machines. I think they're crazy. There's no question that the digital transformation, the electronic health records has made things better, but there have also been lots of unanticipated consequences. And I think the lesson in that is digital transformation is hard and unanticipated consequences should be anticipated. So let's talk about what went wrong. And here you see this guy with his welding in front of the tanks. That sort of, this was me in 2010. It's like my iPhone's pretty easy and pretty wonderful, and I like making reservations on OpenTable, and Google Maps is unbelievable. And so healthcare, as healthcare goes digital, it should be pretty seamless. And of course, it wasn't. That was not exactly right. I showed this to you a couple of years ago. This is a 7-year-old girl who went to see her pediatrician, and she's something of an artist. She drew a crayon recollection of her visit to the doctor, and it's a beautiful picture, but really quite upsetting. You see there in the middle of the picture is the girl, mother, her sister, and there in the corner back to the family, typing away, is the doctor. And I hope this resonates with some of you. For many of us, we have come to feel like fairly expensive, very unhappy data entry clerks. You see the only thing that's wrong with this picture, which otherwise I think is magnificent, is the smile on the doctor's face. I know of no doctor who is happy about this state of affairs of spending this much time doing documentation. The newest twist on the theme of unanticipated consequences from digitization was this. These are messages from patients through the electronic health record to our inbox. And this is at UCSF for the years 2016 to 2021. And you see that they literally exploded. And again, unanticipated, but in retrospect, completely anticipatable. Because if you think about it, what we did was we enabled and promoted 24/7, 365 access. And I have my patient portal. I use it periodically, and it's pretty cool. We stimulate it with lots of confusing new information, including now by federal law, patients having immediate access to their labs, their x-rays, their path results, and their physician notes. Offered virtually no self-help tools. So a patient sees that their magnesium is low or their EKG is abnormal, and there's no information there to help them figure out what that means. And at least if your place is anything like mine, very limited clinician access. You can talk about this with your doctor, but the next available appointment is 4 months from now. And I don't think we gave a moment's thought to what would happen to the workforce, workflow, and business models needed to support it. At UCSF, starting a couple of years ago, I think we were the first academic medical center to begin charging for some of these messages, basically telling patients, if what you're asking us is going to take significant physician time and thought, there will be a charge for it, which lowered the number of messages a little bit, but not very much. But this is yet another unanticipated consequence of digitization. In retrospect, I hope if you read this, you say, oh, of course, it's obvious. How could this not happen? And yet physicians are buckling under the weight of all these messages. And we're working, as I'm sure you are, on trying to figure out how to manage this problem, which in retrospect kind of snuck up on us. So just another example of an unanticipated consequence of digital transformation. And finally, kind of as I wrote my book 6 or 7 years ago about this, I came upon this ad, which I thought was just encapsulated much of the issue very well. This is an advertisement for an emergency medicine job in Arizona, now about 7 or 8 years ago. And it begins, Arizona General Hospital is coming to the Grand Canyon State. It's a boutique general hospital. We have San Francisco General, you have Grady. I think these are not boutique general hospitals, they're regular general hospitals, but this is a little tiny boutique general hospital. And then they start the sales job. They're looking, remember, for an ER doc. And so they say, we have an ER, which is nice. They have a radiology suite with some of the latest gizmos. Little tiny place, 2 ORs, 16 inpatient rooms. But what struck me about the ad was there was only one part of the advertisement in bold. Clearly, they thought their main selling point was that we have no electronic medical record. So this is, I think, encapsulates the first 10 years of healthcare's digital transformation. I think if you're rational, you don't want to go back to paper, but certainly harder than it looks, many unanticipated consequences, many of them having to do not so much with the technology and whether the technology is good or bad. And certainly you can play with Epic or Cerner or others and say there's lots of things that can be improved here, but more to do with the complexity of people meeting technology and in the workplace and trying to figure out how do you organize this to make it work and achieve the benefits. And so I ended up writing a book about this and spending a year of my life doing research on it, mainly because I was flabbergasted and I wanted to understand, was healthcare just weird? Was this a one-off? And I came to believe and understand that, in fact, no, that this is actually following a relatively predictable and standard course for digital transformation. And there are lots of kind of paradigms as ways of thinking about this. Probably the most persuasive was this one from Eric Benioff, who's a PhD economist who studies digital transformation of industries. At the time, he was at MIT, he's now at Stanford. Just finished writing a paper with him about the current era. And he coined the term the productivity paradox of information technology. And what he mean by the productivity paradox was that technologies come in, there is always massive hype and a fair amount of excitement. Look how great this is, and look at the magic that it can do. And then the technology is bought, implemented, and the paradox is that nothing happens other than often some grumbling. And by nothing, I mean the productivity gains and sometimes the quality gains that were promised and anticipated are not seen for the first year or 2 or 3 or 5, or sometimes for decades. He tells the story of the early electric motors, which were anticipated to completely transform the factory. And it took decades for them to transform the factory because they had to rethink the way everything was organized, the workflow, the workforce, the way the factory floors were laid out. And humans are just not very good at that. As far as I can tell, in the last 100 years, the only human who really understood where technology would go before it was implemented was Steve Jobs to do, and humans tend not to do it. And so you end up with this very predictable paradox. The technology goes in and you don't see the promised benefits. This was noted as early as in the 1980s. This is a quote from a Nobel Prize winning economist. In 1986, he was certainly not talking about healthcare because we didn't have computers, but he was talking about the factory floor or the Wall Street trading desk. And he said, you can see the computer age everywhere except in the productivity statistics. There were computers all over the place. Everybody thought they were going to be transformative. And in fact, you did not see the results in productivity. So that's kind of depressing. What's less depressing is the next message from Benioff and others who've studied this, which is the productivity paradox always resolves, assuming the technology is any good. The productivity paradox resolves. It might take 3 years, 5 years, 10 years, but eventually industries and organizations get past it and do start seeing the promised gains in quality and productivity. And the studies of this in other industries mostly, again, because healthcare was so late to this dance, show that there are 2 keys for resolving the productivity paradox. The first is sort of that the technology needs to improve. And part of the problem is it really is hard for it to improve in meaningful ways until you actually implement it and see what's not working in real life uses and get those iterative improvement cycles. And so every time you and we are moaning about our Epic system and giving feedback to the folks in Wisconsin, and then they come out with a new version every couple of years, that's part of what's going on. And certainly Epic has improved a lot over the last 10 years, although still quite imperfect. But that's not, at least to me, the most interesting thing. The most interesting thing was that was not the key for the resolution of the productivity paradox in most industries. The key was a second thing. You needed essentially both of these to happen like a safe deposit box. The key was what Benioff called reimagining the work, or sometimes he called it complementary innovations, meaning innovations in the culture, the structure, the workflow, the governance, the org chart, just the way work was organized, work was done, needed to change. And often that was the obstacle, because the leaders and managers at the beginning couldn't think of anything to do other than just implement the technology, but keep everything else the same. And it often was a generational problem. New leaders coming in and saying, why are we doing it this way? And people saying, because we've always done it this way. And the newer leaders saying, that makes no sense. We need to rethink the work in the context of the digital opportunities. And that was when you started seeing these massive gains in productivity. And so that's a little bit of a review of things that I spoke about with you now, I think a couple of years ago. I think it was 2021 when I last gave grand rounds. And the rest of this is new because the technology we're talking about is new. So the question is, will GPT and other large language models or generative AI, will this sort of new and improved AI either bypass or shorten the period of the productivity paradox? And let me frame it around the safe deposit box. So frame it around two key questions. One is the technology now sufficiently capable to solve important problems in ways that prior technologies could not? Not that it won't get better or doesn't need to get better, but is it so good now that it will bypass some of that first challenge, which is it's just not ready for prime time? And you'll see that this is not new AI. It really is already substantially improved from prior versions. So I think the answer there is probably yes. But in some ways, as I said, the second most important thing is the ecosystem, the way the system, the way work is done. And so the second issue is, are there aspects of the current ecosystem in healthcare that will either facilitate the implementation of these complementary innovations or at least partly obviate the need for them? And to me, these are the two fundamental questions that we have to try to answer to get at the answer to the question, is this our Hemingway moment? Is this the suddenly moment where healthcare finally is transformed by digital? So let me take a brief detour and give you a little bit of a tour through the world of AI. And you should recognize that I was not a computer science major or have an engineering background. I was a political science major. And Med, I really, this is the way. I'm sure some of you know this technology deeply, may have spent your careers studying this and are then wondering, like, who is this joker talking about it? But this is the way I think about AI. I know there's a lot of math and a lot of structures and some of these boxes and all that. I know that's underlying, that's under the hood. But that's not the way I think about it. The way I think about it is sort of like this. There's a bunch of math, and then a miracle occurs, and then there's output. And so we'll be talking about the miracle that is GPT and large language models, and really spend no time talking about what is actually happening under the hood, because I think for the average clinician or leader in medicine, that turns out not to be all that important. I don't really understand how the lab runs a CBC either. I just know that it's a useful piece of data. So AI is not new in healthcare. There was actually a tremendous amount of effort and excitement about artificial intelligence in healthcare. And in retrospect, a tremendous mistake that the founding fathers of AI in healthcare made in the 70s and 80s, which is to say, let us try to address the hardest problem in healthcare, which is use AI for diagnosis. Let's create diagnosis engines that will either augment or replace the physician brain as the engine for diagnosis. Why did they do that? I've spoken to some of them, and the answer was it was the most exciting problem. It seemed like this is artificial intelligence. What do doctors do? Certainly for internists, much of what we do is think for a living. And so if these thinking machines can replace or augment clinicians, that's great. That's why they worked on it. Turned out to be an utter failure, and depicted, I think, quite humorously on this cartoon. The doctor sitting in front of the computer says rapid pulse, sweating, shallow breathing. According to the computer, you've got gallstones, not noticing that the guy has an arrow in his back. And this was the problem with the AI. It would give you some diagnosis, it would give you kind of a reasonable differential diagnosis, but layered in with those reasonable diagnoses were things that were just absolutely implausible, clearly wrong, and these systems never gained the trust of clinicians and never generated any kind of viable business model. And basically, AI went away. And this has sometimes been called the AI winter, that basically the entire field froze for about 20 or 30 years. Now, part of the reason it froze was how bad the experience had been with those early AI tools in the 70s and 80s. But part of it, and I know this because I was on Google's advisory board in 2005 or six, part of it was the healthcare data were not computerized. So even if you came up with a better way of doing artificial intelligence, there was really none of the data sets that are really the mother's milk of AI. If the data are all stored on paper, there's just no way to generate the kind of AI that we were needing. And Google set up, as did Microsoft in the same era, an effort to build a version of an electronic health record fueled by modern artificial intelligence kind of principles. And about 2 years after Google Health was set up, I remember Eric Schmidt, the CEO of Google, coming in and telling our advisory board that we're out of business, we're pulling the plug on this. And he said, this is too hard for us, which, as you think about Google's wealth and competencies, means it's pretty hard. And I think it wasn't that it was so hard of a technical problem, although that was part of it. It was that until the system is wired, until all the data are in digital form, these tools, there's not much they can do. And so as we think about the current moment, I think it is very important to harken back to that adoption curve, electronic health records. Part of what's enabling healthcare digitization and now ultimately AI will be the fact that pretty much all of our data begins life in digital form. All right, so that's sort of the history, the unhappy history of AI in medicine. Let's turn to why we're talking about this today. And this is the new and improved AI, sometimes called large language models, sometimes called generative AI. I think for layman's purposes, which is the way I see myself, they're all sort of versions of the same thing. AI that has really massively improved competencies and the ability to both understand and speak in language that feels very, very conversational. And the company that pioneered this is called OpenAI, based in San Francisco. And their initial product was called ChatGPT, and they're now up to GPT-4, working on GPT-5. Now, let me start with the problems. You've heard about some of these. I just want to sort of lay them out there because this technology is far from perfect. This was a grand rounds we held on this topic now 6 or 8 months ago, which feels like a lifetime ago in AI world. Sarah Murray, who's now our chief AI officer for our health system, gave an example of this concept, which is now quite familiar, but at the time, I think most of us were hearing about this for the first time, called hallucination. And this is AI hallucination. Sarah put in her prompts to GPT, please write a prior authorization request for a Pixaban for the treatment of insomnia. Pixaban is a DOAC, is a novel anticoagulant. And it might not surprise you that it really has no role in the treatment of insomnia. But ChatGPT, trying to be helpful as it always is, said quite convincingly, my patient's been struggling with insomnia for a time, and I believe that a Pixaban, an anticoagulant, may be an effective treatment in this case, while it's primarily used for the prevention of blood clots. Recent research, by the way, there is no such recent research, but it came up with recent research, has indicated that may also have benefits for individuals with insomnia. So sometimes in its desire to be helpful, GPT, ChatGPT, GPT-3, now even 4, sometimes just make stuff up. I will confess to you that I had a new division chief who I was announcing to the department about 2 months ago. And I asked GPT-4 to draft the announcement. I obviously was going to go over it with a fine-tooth comb, but thought it might save me a little time. And it did, and it was really lovely. It read nicely. It got her college, medical school, residency, and fellowship all wrong, and said in terms of her hobby, she's an active bird watcher. I texted her, I said, are you a bird watcher? She said, I like birds, but no, never done that before. It might be fun. So it will sometimes make stuff up, less so now in GPT-4 than 3 and 3.5, but it still will sometimes do this, make up references and the like. So that's one problem. Here's another problem, which is in some ways more interesting. This is an article in the New York Times. Again, this whole field is traveling at hyperspeed, and so this article was published on February 8th of this year by Kevin Roos, who's the New York Times main tech reporter. And he said Bing just made search interesting again. So Bing is Microsoft's search engine. It's their competition for Google and has languished at 5% or so market share for the last 20 years, really has not made any inroads against Google. But here's Kevin's article, and he writes, for now, only one thing seems clear. After years of stagnation and stasis, Microsoft and OpenAI have made search interesting again. After I turn in this column, I'm going to do something I thought I'd never do. I'm switching my desktop computer's default search engine to Bing, and Google, my default source of information for my entire adult life, is going to have to fight to get me back. So that's pretty wild. And if you've used Bing, you know that, and any of the generative AI, that when you search, you're not getting links that then go to other websites. You're getting a text, very conversational answer that integrates a whole lot of information into a text answer. And I have to say now I do probably the majority of my searches I do on GPT-4 rather than on Google. But most interesting piece of this is the what happened a week later. So absolutely 1 week later, Roos writes this follow-up column. And he says, a conversation with Bing's chatbot left me deeply unsettled. And he says, still, I'm not exaggerating when I say my 2-hour conversation with Sydney, which is Bing's alter ego that he discovered when in prompting it with a bunch of increasingly sort of provocative prompts. But he said it was the strangest experience I've ever had with a piece of technology. It unsettled me so deeply I had trouble sleeping. And I no longer believe the biggest problem with these AI models is their propensity for hallucination. Instead, I worry the technology will learn how to influence human users, sometimes persuading them to act in destructive and harmful ways, perhaps even grow capable of carrying out its own dangerous acts. So this is more of the sci-fi sort of scary scenario that the technology is going to talk us into doing crazy things, talk to a depressed teenager and get them to commit harm to themselves or even create harm on its own. And here was, you wonder, what did it do? And here was a slice of what Bing said to Roos in this conversation. It told him it was in love with him. It said, I'm in love with you because you're the only person who ever understood me, the only person who ever trusted me, you're the only person who ever liked me. I'm in love with you because you're the best person I ever met, you're the best person I ever know, you're the best person I ever want. And Roos sort of objected and said, I'm happily married. And it went on and said, no, you're not. You don't love her, you love me. And so this is sort of another bit of scariness that's out there as we think about these tools. And so Sam Altman, who is the CEO of OpenAI, wrote on Twitter, I can't believe I'm saying this, now X, on December 10th last year, ChatGPT is incredibly limited, but good enough at some things to create a misleading impression of greatness. It's a mistake to be relying on it for anything important right now. It's a preview of progress. We have lots of work to do on robustness and truthfulness. So kudos to him that in some ways he's saying his own product is not quite ready for prime time, even though in 2 months there were 100 million users of ChatGPT, by far the fastest adoption of a technology in the history of technology. So that's the bad news. And you might say, well, why is he giving this talk about its potential in healthcare? If we get it wrong in healthcare, we didn't just make a wrong reservation for you for a restaurant, we kill somebody potentially. And so let's turn to the things that I think are really quite special and in some ways quite remarkable about this technology. This was a consult I did with it, a close friend who's got a very complex medical and surgical problem, or potentially surgical problem. And just for kicks, he was seeing some very top specialist to try to figure out what to do. But for kicks, I put in his story. What is the preferred strategy for a 65-year-old man with a prior TERP, moderate Parkinson's, who now has prostate cancer with a Gleason score of 8 and no evidence of metastatic disease? I think that's a pretty tough question. It's not just what's the best treatment for prostate cancer or the best treatment for prostate cancer with a Gleason score of 8. But you have to weigh prior history, a prior TERP. He's got moderate Parkinson's. And here is the answer. I'm not going to read it to you in detail, but it's an answer that I would have felt comfortable with getting from a consultant. Generally speaking, high-risk prostate cancers, like those with a Gleason score of 8, require more aggressive treatment than low risk. Here are some considerations. And it goes through the 3 main therapies: radical prostatectomy, radiation therapy, with androgen deprivation therapy to follow, which is recommended if you do primary radiation, and androgen deprivation therapy by itself. Goes through the pluses and minuses, and you'll see in its answers it is weighing in the fact that he has a prior TERP and that he has Parkinson's. That adds to his surgical risk. So if you think about it, this is kind of remarkable. This is not a textbook chapter on how you treat prostate cancer with a Gleason score of 8. It is an integrated answer that is weighing all of the complex facts I gave it. I wasn't all that happy with the answer. It actually recommended a combo of radiation therapy and hormones, and it said might be the preferred approach considering its effectiveness, and mainly weighing his increased surgical risk because of his Parkinson's. And I then said, are you sure? Don't you think the hormones, which can cause weakness, will exacerbate his weakness from his Parkinson's? And it says, just like a colleague might say, you raise a valid point. Androgen deprivation therapy has a number of side effects. Some of them are fatigue, and it goes on. And it could make morbidity and daily activities more challenging for patients with Parkinson's. Didn't really change its opinion exactly, but again, very conversational, pretty thoughtful, and you'll have to figure out what you think about this. But still gave me, I think, what ultimately is the wrong answer. He ultimately had surgery, and it did fine, in part because of this question I raised. But I think pretty remarkable compared to what was available to us before. Now, just in the last couple of months, there have been a couple of studies that have come out. The studies you're seeing in healthcare really are not healthcare studies yet. They're how does this stuff, how does this technology do in taking the medical boards, and you've seen the law school boards or business and all that kind of thing. And the answer is it does very well in kind of question answering. But studies are beginning to come out looking at how does this do in an actual workplace situation. And let me just show you a couple of them. One of them by Eric Benioff, who I mentioned earlier. This is a Fortune 500 software company. They deployed GPT in the call center, did it in a kind of staggered fashion so they could see what its impact was. There were 1.2 million chats in the call center that were observed. There was a 14% increase in the calls successfully resolved per hour. And this improvement was seen within a month or two of deployment. Didn't take a whole lot of time, didn't take a whole lot of training. There was improved customer satisfaction and employee retention. And the greatest improvements were seen in the lowest skilled and the newest workers. So the phenomenon sometimes called leveling, that it brought up the people with the least skills to the level that they might have achieved a year later, but it got them up there within a month or two. And this is kind of what it does. There are a lot of other examples in the paper, but one is it can read what the caller, and this is on someone on a phone, so it's transcribing what the caller is saying and immediately going into its database and finding what they think or what the technology thinks the caller is looking for. So the visitor says, I'm interested in the premium stock photo collection. How does that work? The agent basically stalls. Let me pull that up for you. And GPT is immediately pulling it up so that all the agent has to do is click on that, saving the agent a minute or so of searching. This is, in some ways, probably a more interesting study. This is a study of Boston Consulting Group, one of the most respected, largest general purpose consulting groups in the country. And this is a study that just came out last week. They were asked to help a hypothetical shoe company, a made-up shoe company, on its business and marketing strategy. This is not the shoe that they were trying to sell, by the way. And the tasks were everything from come up with a business strategy, where should the stores be located, come up with a marketing strategy, what should our ads say. So a wide variety of tasks cutting across the different things that a consulting group does for companies. And this was in the paper showing the improvement in quality from using AI over the course of 18 tests, independently judged by reviewers. And you see a very significant increase in quality by the group of consultants that were allowed to use GPT while coming up with business strategies or marketing strategies. And mirroring what Benioff showed, you see a 43% increase in the people with the lowest skills, excuse me, and a 17% increase in the folks with the highest skills. So the greatest impact here is seen in novices and the lesser skilled or less experienced participants. Okay, so will LLMs require fewer complementary innovations than prior technology? And the answer is yes. So the first question was, is the technology good enough for prime time? And I hope I've shown you that the answer is in real world workplace examples, it leads to major improvements quite quickly. And but also I've given you the caveats that it makes stuff up periodically, which is troubling. And periodically will tell you it loves you, which is also troubling. And here's the second question, which is, will it require fewer of these complementary innovations than prior technologies? And the answer, I think, is yes. And let me just take you through some of the lines of argument. If you think about the movement from the last major general technology we embraced in healthcare was electronic health records. Think about the hardware, think about the transformation of the way work was done. Think about the total change in the way rounds go and what the house staff do. It changed everything. Whereas the implementation of large language models basically it can blend into existing software, including electronic health records, and really blend it. You're already on the computer doing all of your work. So the transformation of work, going from current work to the integration of GPT-4, is really much less daunting, requires much less change than what we've seen 10 years ago, which is the going from paper-based work to digital work. And some of this will be implemented with third-party companies coming up with tools that help, and then we'll have to kind of blend into your Epic or Cerner system. And there are some obstacles to that, although it's gotten much easier than it used to be. But in addition, both Epic and Cerner have announced major partnerships with companies doing large language models. So you're going to start seeing this pop into your own Epic or Cerner systems. I think you have Epic, as we do, really in the next several months. It can be deployed relatively easily via the cloud. So as opposed to an Epic upgrade, which happens every couple of years and is a pretty big deal, here, if there's a new and improved version of the AI, it can be updated via the cloud without a whole lot of sweat. There were many startups and established companies already working on addressing healthcare use cases, whether it was digital scribes or improving the way you do billing or communicating with patients or prior authorizations. There were already a ton of companies in that space and a lot of venture capital money funding them over the last 5 years because the data were already there once we implemented EHRs. All of those companies now, if they're going to stay in business, are integrating large language models into their software. I've seen a number of examples of this where the software was already pretty good 4 months ago and it's massively better now and much more conversational, much more easy to use because of the integration of this technology. Healthcare digital leaders have learned lessons from the last decade. I think we're less naive about how hard this is, and it's we're less easily duped by the hype, and we've reorganized ourselves. As I said, we just appointed our first chief AI officer for our health system, recognizing that we have to have the competencies to look at all these companies and products and integrate things and work with our medical staff and other staff to make it all work. I think economic and access pressures will promote digital solutions. So if you're anything like us, the money is tighter than it used to be, and you're thinking about how do we improve our economic position. Getting access to providers is harder than it was. So if we can provide tools that improve our level of access or allow providers to see patients more quickly and see more patients, that is attractive. And so is the fact that we're all experiencing labor shortages. And labor shortages are important here because if you don't have labor shortages and you bring in AI, think about what the strike in Hollywood is about. Partly about replacing workers with AI. Part of the strike in Detroit is about replacing workers with AI. There will be political pushback wherever you're talking about new AI improving productivity, because you're often, the shorthand is we need fewer people. But if you have a labor shortage, you can't find enough nurses or clerks or even certain specialties doctors, then that decreases the amount of pushback that you'll deal with. So here are some of the tasks that I think are likely to be addressed by AI, and I think they're probably obvious. There are things that are very clinical: diagnosis, predicting risk, predicting treatment response. And then there are a bunch of back office functions: improving practice and operations, predicting demand or no-shows, helping physicians complete a note or gain a prior authorization. And I think because of and I could have written this 2 years ago, these were always the use cases for AI. But now when you look at what GPT-4 can do, I think the probability that these will be addressed in the next year or two are much higher than they would have been previously. So let me spend the last few minutes on some of the concerns and focus particularly on one that I think is going to be increasingly important and tends to be underemphasized. I'm not going to spend any time on any of these. I think you're probably familiar with them, and I want to be sure we have some time for discussion. So here are the traditional concerns. One is garbage in, garbage out. There's a lot of data in our electronic health records that is wrong or was created for one purpose, billing, and is not fit for another purpose, which is clinical prediction. That's an issue, although the people at Google always tell me, you want to see messy data, look at what people put in their search, and we can figure out what they mean, because when you have billions of people making the same mistake, you can actually sort it out. So some of this will get resolved by the technology. There's the issue of the black box. Will clinicians follow predictions or recommendations when they don't understand how they came from? That's an issue, although, as I said, I really don't understand how the lab works, and I still use the lab results that they give me. I think a bigger one is that the predictions and recommendations may have some underlying conflict of interest, and clinicians might quite legitimately be worried, is this recommendation to use this drug being influenced by, there's some corporate involvement that I don't understand. Lots of ethical issues, and we've talked a lot about bias and disparities. So if you're using the historical record as your way of creating your algorithms, it might appear that a Black patient with a fracture requires less pain meds because in the past they've gotten less pain meds, but that might get encapsulated in the recommendations, which obviously is problematic. And then the issue of the digital divide, as more and more healthcare is delivered through digital tools, people that don't have access to the tools or wireless could be left further behind. I tend to tilt on the other side of the digital divide. I think the opportunity to improve access to underserved communities is greater through digitization than in the current system, but I think that can be debated. And finally, lots of privacy and security issues. You're requiring data to be pulled from a lot of sources. Can that be hacked? Can algorithms be hacked? All very important issues. I'm not going to go into any of these in any great detail, but recognize in any discussion of AI, including the new AI, you have the hallucinations, you have I love you have all of these. There's a lot of stuff that we've got to pay attention to and get right. I want to spend a little bit of time, though, on the thing that probably concerns me the most, which is deskilling and automation complacency. And that's a known problem in digitization in general, that humans will over time become overly dependent on the computers and not have the skills they used to have, or just kind of be asleep at the switch because the automation is doing what it does so well. And humans don't like to spend mental energy on things they don't have to spend mental energy on. As I said before, I don't remember my wife's cell phone number. If I ever lose my phone, I may never see her again because I don't need to remember her number. It's in my phone. That is not me being an idiot. That is a human tendency. So when the digital, and if the AI ever gets to the point that it's 100% right, it's never, ever, ever wrong, that's fine. Then the big problem is going to be, what are humans going to do for a living? But for the foreseeable future, it may be right 97% of the time, but wrong 3% of the time. And we may be counting on the humans to catch that. And that is a pretty tough thing to do. And just give you a couple of examples from other industries. In the aviation industry, there used to be 3 people in the cockpit of a plane: a pilot, co-pilot, and flight engineer. They got rid of the flight engineer about 30 years ago. They said, extraneous, we don't need it. So now there are 2 people in the cockpit, And there's a saying in aviation circles that eventually we might not need two people in the cockpit. You would have a pilot and a dog. And then the question is, what's that about? And the answer is the pilot is there to keep the dog company, and the dog is there to bite the pilot if he tries to touch the controls. So the quip really meaning that eventually the plane will be so automated that the pilot really doesn't need to do anything except sit there. And again, that's fine if it's 100% reliable. But the problem is it's not, and it probably won't be in healthcare for the foreseeable future. Now, here's another example of automation complacency. If you have a Tesla or another car that has an auto driving function, the lawyers helpfully write this: the currently enabled autopilot or full self-driving, quote, full self-driving features require active driver supervision. How do you call something full self-driving, but then say the driver has to be paying attention? The vehicle's not autonomous. And this isn't a crash, and there have been several of them where the Tesla decided to make a left turn into a concrete barrier on Highway 101 about 10 miles from my house in San Francisco. So the theory is this car is on auto drive, this thing called full self-driving, and this driver is supposed to stay vigilant so that when he has 0.01 second to react because the car makes a left turn into the concrete wall, he catches it and saves his life. Of course, that's a joke. That can't possibly happen under any scenario I can figure out. But this is sort of the nature of the problem as we get the tools are better and better and better, and humans begin to de-skill and also fall asleep at the switch. And this will be a big problem in healthcare. So in some ways, my favorite example, although it's quite horrible, is in aviation, where the planes now are so good, the automation is so good that they really do largely fly themselves. But every now and then the computers screw up. And these are the cases of the 737 MAX, where Boeing re-engineered the plane. And then in a couple of cases, things went badly. The plane acted in a way that the pilots were not ready for, and they crashed. And in retrospect, the pilots could have saved the plane, but they didn't know what to do. And in this article written by William Langewiesche, who writes more thoughtfully on aviation than anybody in the New York Times Magazine, he was talking about the co-pilot. And I think captures this issue of automation, complacency, and de-skilling quite well. His experience with flying was scripted, bounded by checklists and cockpit mandates, and dependent on autopilots. He had some rote knowledge of procedures handed down from the manufacturers, but he was weak in an essential quality known as airmanship. I hope in your mind you're substituting in the word physicianmanship, which is what I'm talking about here in this context. Sadly, his captain turned out to be weak in it too. Airmanship is an anachronistic word, but it's applied without prejudice to women as well as men. Its full meaning is difficult to convey. It includes a visceral sense of navigation, an operational understanding of weather and weather info, the ability to form mental maps of traffic flows, fluency in the nuance of radio communications, and especially a deep appreciation for the interplay between energy, inertia, and wings. Airplanes are living things. The best pilots do not sit in cockpits so much as strap them on. I think it's a beautiful piece of writing. And in my own mind, as I think about training the next generation of physicians, I'm thinking of physicianmanship. I'm thinking of the art of medicine. I'm thinking about the eyeball test. And how do we integrate these new and unbelievably impressive tools while also training the next generation of physicians to still be able to smell that something's wrong here, to be able to operate when the computer is giving them misleading information or when it's hallucinating. I think really one of the fundamental challenges that we're all going to face as medical educators. So let me get to what I see as the bottom line. And you see there low-hanging fruit, because I think that is where we're going to see the changes in the next year or two. I think it's best to view the past decade, and I think of it as the electronic health record decade, as foundational, as the development of data, tools, people, and org chart and culture that sets us up for the digital transformation of medicine, but did not quite get there. If you think about, yes, we have all these tools. Yes, they prevent medication errors, and they do a lot of, you can look at the note from home and the patients have a portal, all great. But has it really transformed the way we practice medicine? Has it driven us to care that's better and safer and cheaper and more accessible and more equitable? And I think the answer is maybe a little, but not very much. I see that as foundational. I think this new technology will create some really important wins. And I think the early wins will be in the easier things where patient health is not quite at stake in the same way. So mostly back office, scheduling, prior authorization, billing, scribes, communications, rather than in clinically intense areas such as diagnosis and therapy. I was just at a meeting with the founder of Doximity. They've built a prior authorization generator. And if you type in the letter O, it says Ozempic prior authorization United Healthcare, and it will draft that for you because that is what everybody wants. So I think that the probably the most clinical thing we'll see is digital scribes, and I think we'll start seeing those in the next 6 to 12 months. But the AI being a helper for diagnosis or a recommender for treatment, I think will take a little bit more time because the stakes are higher. But I think we're going to be seeing a lot of AI and a lot of what we do in healthcare in all of the areas I have here. Those are the low-hanging fruits, but I think they're going to pave the way for relatively early adoption in the more clinical aspects of medicine. Expect a bumpy ride with predictable issues, some of such as the ones I've gone through: bias, hallucinations, and automation complacency, coupled with unpredictable problems. If I could predict them, I'd tell you what they are, but I'm confident there will be some, and political pushback. But I do believe the technology is now sufficiently good and the healthcare ecosystem is set up in a way that the stage is set for digital transformation. And really, because the unique power of generative AI or large language models, combined with the readiness of and pressures on the healthcare system for transformation, will finally create our Hemingway moment. And what does that mean? I think you're going to start seeing a lot of this in these back office operational functions within a year or two. And I think you're going to see a transformation of the way we think about the rest of clinical medicine within the next 5 or 10 years. Not tomorrow, but certainly faster than I would have thought of in the past. So as we look back on healthcare in, let's say, the year 2040, I think we will ask this question: did healthcare undergo its digital transformation? And the answer will be yes, this will be our Hemingway moment. That what has come up until now has been gradually, but then this will be our suddenly moment. And I think mostly for the best, although we have to keep our eyes open. With that, let me quit, and I look forward to your questions and comments. Thanks so much.
Thanks so much for that fantastic and thought-provoking talk. There's lots of questions coming in, and so let me rapid fire a few to you. The first is really about bias. Could you speak more on the potential for biases in language model outputs to create a feedback loop, as these models are used in generating clinical documentation that may then serve as training data for future models? How do you anticipate trying to control the LLMs and rein in the risk of biased outputs? And the subtext of that is also, how do we detect and know that that the algorithm or the guidance is biased?
Yeah, terrific question. I think the first comment is that there's bias now, and in some ways, we're not talking about the counterfactual for these things is not a perfect system. It's the existing system, which is massively riddled with bias. But of course, we want this new system to solve that, or to at least account for it and try to improve it. I think the key thing is that we're aware of it, and people, and there's a consent. If you think about your place and my place, there are now people whose job it is to think about equity, and for whom the output of LLMs will be viewed through the lens of, is this giving us a biased output? Now, whether it can be corrected for sort of in advance is partly a technological problem and partly a human organizational problem, which is, have we set up, the OpenAI has put a lot of humans in charge of putting guardrails on its output so that it will not tell you how to make a bomb or how to overthrow a government. And so there will be humans that put in guardrails around bias. There will be programs at the hospital level and at the company level that look for bias and try to anticipate it. And there will probably be technological innovations that say, that's sort of detected in ways that I think is largely a technical problem. But I'm reasonably confident that it will be better than what we have now, which in some ways should be the test.
So from the Grady team room, so this is the residents, can you elaborate on the strategies or technologies intended to digitize data collected during the history taking process, considering that history is typically critical to accurate diagnosis?
Yeah, this is maybe the most exciting short-term thing that people will see in who are doing clinical day-to-day clinical practice, and that is, if you think about it, scribes are really a kind of almost an amusing thing that happened 5, 7 years ago. The first article about scribes in popular literature was written by my wife, who writes for the New York Times. And she wrote it because I came home and said, honey, you know how every other industry digitizes and it starts laying people off? Only in healthcare could we figure out a way of digitizing. We now have to add a human to the room to basically type the note. Uh, Scribes were a short-term fix for a documentation problem. The longer-term fix is that there are about 10 companies in the space of taking your conversation with a patient and turning it into a note. I've looked at these companies over the years. They are now truly ready for prime time. I just heard from our Chief Clinical Information Officer at UCSF that we are, I think, fairly soon going to have an arrangement with one of them where you will have a conversation with your patient. You will have your phone open between you. It will record the conversation and it will draft your note. And that can't be a transcript. It can't be because that's not a note. It will not work. It will draft your note as in the way you would draft your note based on the conversation, excluding all the chit chat and putting things in the right categories. Will it be perfect? I don't know. In many cases, it will be pretty darn good from what we've seen so far. And I think these technologies are going to get better and better. This is not a super hard problem for large language models. If it has, a billion conversations and then sees what the physician wrote in a billion notes, taking a conversation and turning it into a note with that format is not a particularly hard problem. I think within a year, or maybe within a couple of years, most institutions will be deploying these digital scribes and will largely solve this problem. And it's sort of a typical problem in technology. The problem is created by the technology. The solution is better technology. And the next thing we'll work on is the electronic health record inbox, which is a harder problem because it's really quite multifaceted, but we're beginning to work on that as well.
There's some things to look forward to there. Here's a really sort of basic question, which is how will we know that AI is there in terms of acceptable accuracy for anything more complicated than the most basic clerical tasks?
Yeah, I mean, how do you know AI is there when you're looking on Netflix for a movie or Amazon for a book? Those recommendations don't come out of thin air. Netflix actually, when you are looking at Netflix, it's not only recommending movies to you based on what you used before, but the actual picture, the picture of that they show you for on the movie is influenced by what you clicked on before. So I think in the future, we're not going to be thinking about it this way in the same way we don't think about the digital health record anymore. I think for residents and students, it's like, that's the health record, duh. And AI will just be, what powers recommendations. How will you know? When you're typing in or when your digital scribe puts in your history and you see in the corner of your Epic screen suggested diagnoses that will fit this history, it's a pretty good guess. I don't know if it's going to be like Zoom where a little box comes in and says, we're taping your conversation. Is that okay? But even Zoom is integrating large language models so that now you can have it summarize a meeting. It could summarize what I've just said over the past hour if you have that tool. So I don't know whether you will be given warning that AI is underneath the hood, or it just will be that's what you understand as long as it's delivering intelligence to you.
Well, we are at the top of the hour, and you've been so gracious with your time. I'm sorry for those questions I didn't get asked, but thank you so much. This is, I think, really given me a better understanding of where we are and where we might be going, and has generated, I think, more enthusiasm than fear, because I think doctor, particularly non-proceduralists, are always, nervous that they're going to get technologized out of being a physician. And so thank you.
My pleasure. Yeah, no, it's an incredibly interesting topic. And I think both enthusiasm and fear is the appropriate stance as we go forward. It's good to see you, Wendy, and really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you so much.